You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. Today I'm very excited to share my latest project with you all. The Damp Man Lives, my unofficial sequel to the original Damp Man stories by Allison V. Harding. Many of you know how enamored I am with Harding's work. I even made a video analyzing Harding's underbody, and of course the Damp Man. Links below. There's just something about her style and ideas that resonates with me. I'd had the idea of writing a Damp Man sequel set in modern times, taking place in a location Jen and I explored back in 2014, New Orleans. All that heat and humidity, the fog and the neighboring swamps, makes for the perfect setting for a tale concerning a man of moisture. I won't say too much here, but if you're unfamiliar with the original stories, you may want to listen to them first, though it isn't absolutely essential. I'll pop a link to the trilogy below. And a huge thanks to the wonderful Vishnu Prasad for his extremely accurate portrayal of the titular figure himself. I hope you enjoy this one, folks. The Damp Man Lives by Ian Gordon. 1. It was just after 11, and the French Quarter was breathing. Lucy Pelgrim stepped out of the candlelit hush of the Marini Jazz Bar and into the close, expectant night. The rain had stopped some time ago, but the air still hung heavy with the smell of warm stone and rotting blossoms. Jazz, messy, dissonant, dripping from the walls, still echoed behind her. But outside, the music had turned to mist, footfalls, and the occasional mutter of tires on wet asphalt. She walked alone, as she often did. Solitude was an old friend. The narrow streets were emptying now, shedding the last of the Friday night crowds, leaving only the booze-sodden wanderers and those strange few who linger for their own reasons. The lamps, those old-fashioned gaslit lanterns, burned orange and crooked. Their glow rippled in the puddles and danced across the dark storefronts like small, watery ghosts. Lucy's pace was even, measured, the walk of someone sensitive to a city's shadows. She wore a long leather coat buttoned to the collar. Her shoulder bag was heavy with notebooks, a set of keys looped between two fingers. By trade, she was a journalist, the kind of investigator who listened in corners, followed music and memory through the arteries of the town. Her latest piece, a profile on the rebirth of Frenchman Street's underground brass scene, was due tomorrow. It was good, she knew it, but it'd be great by morning. Her apartment was 12 blocks away. She turned down Dauphine Street, heels clicking lightly on the slick pavement, and paused under a street lamp to light a cigarette. That was when she felt it again. The presence. It had started 2 nights ago. A sense that she was not alone. The prickling of hairs along the back of her neck. A shape glimpsed in a reflection just a moment too late to verify. She turned her head sharply. Nothing. Across the street stood the silent facade of an antique dealer's storefront, its windows dark, its wrought iron sign swinging lightly. A pale mannequin in an evening gown stood behind the glass, lifeless and leering. Lucy frowned and puffed on the cigarette. This was New Orleans, after all, a city of spirits and strangeness. Ghost tours and voodoo kitsch, yes, but stories under stories. Her grandmother had told her once, in the brittle voice of the dying, that there are things that like the dark, baby girl, things that wait, things that remember. Lucy had been 13, and the words hadn't made much sense then. Linda Pelgrim had always been half of this world, half of the one behind the veil. It was only after she died that Lucy found the old manila folder tucked inside a box under a loose floorboard. The typewriter script had faded to grey, But the title was clear. The Damp Man, GP. She hadn't read it. Not properly. Just glanced through it, saw enough to confirm that it was some sort of long-abandoned manuscript by her grandfather, George. A pulp-style thing, probably, written during the war years or just after. She'd set it aside, intending to look at it someday, but she never had. Up ahead, just before Burgundy, a man stood under the broken halo of a street lamp. Lucy slowed, her eyes narrowing. The figure was tall, broad in the shoulders, dressed in black. The shadows swam around him, making it hard to see clearly. His large face was turned downwards. His hat, a thin-brimmed thing like something out of a sepia photograph, hid his features entirely. He didn't move. Lucy kept walking. He didn't move. She passed him. Still, he didn't move. But she felt it. The weight of his presence. The way he seemed to displace the air, to leave it cooler and thicker in his wake. Lucy crossed the street and looked back. The man was gone. The young journalist didn't run. Not even then. There was iron in her spine, even if she'd never had to prove it until now. She reached her building and climbed the narrow staircase 2 steps at a time. Inside, she locked the door behind her. She stood in the dark kitchen, her breath slow and shallow, and listened. The refrigerator hummed softly. A neighbor's television buzzed through the wall. Rain tapped the window pane like a jilted lover. She poured a glass of red wine, moved to the small writing desk under the window, and fished something out of a drawer. The time-worn manila folder. There it was again, faded but tantalizing. The Damp Man, GP. The first line read, "He came out of the water like a corpse remembering how to walk." Lucy frowned. She closed the folder after the 3rd page. Closed it because she needed to. Because there was something in the way those old words sat on the page that made her skin prickle. Something in the way her grandfather calmly and precisely wrote about things that no living man should have known. He had no blood. The bullets passed through him as through a fog. He was not made for this world, but he intended to make it his. It read like a cheap horror short, the kind that filled the back pages of gas station digests. But it didn't feel cheap. It felt heavy. She poured another half glass and drank it standing. Outside, something passed in front of the window. She turned quickly and caught her reflection in the glass, caught her wide eyes and pale face, hair pulled tight from the rain. There was no one there, but she felt it again, that presence, that nearness, like a cold breath against the back of her neck. Her skin rose, one tiny bump at a time. She moved through the apartment slowly, flicking on every light she encountered. Living room, bedroom, bathroom, hall. The bulbs glowed dimmer than they should have. There had been no outage, no storm, just that creeping, crawling sense of something. At the front door she paused, fingers grazing the bolt. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The envelope was already under it. It was thick and pale grey, the kind of stationery used by hotels with more chandeliers than guests. Her name was written in neat black ink. Miss Lucy Pelgrim, Rue St. Peter, apartment 3C. She carried it to the writing desk and opened it. Inside was a letter. Miss Pelgrim, it is my hope you will forgive this unorthodox method of introduction. My name is Gunther Remsdorf. I'm a philanthropist and historian, newly arrived in New Orleans. I have a particular interest in your grandfather's unpublished writings, and would value the opportunity to speak with you further about his work and legacy. Please allow me to arrange an evening meeting at your convenience. You may contact my office through the Remsdorf Charitable Trust. Discretion is assured. Warmest regards, G. Remsdorf. No phone number, no email address, no contact information whatsoever. Just a wax seal at the bottom, dark red, pressed with an unusual sigil that meant nothing to her. A stylized R in a 7-pointed star. Lucy stared at the letter for a long time. Remsdorf. Somewhere at the back of her mind, something stirred, something instinctive, like a warning. She reached for the manila folder once again, flipped to the second page, and scanned until she found it. She read the words aloud. Remsdorf, Linda said, her voice trembling. He said his name was Remsdorf. That was all. Just the name, dropped like a match in a dry field. Coincidence, that's all it was. Some descendant or eccentric collector who'd inherited the family obsession. Wealthy weirdos had haunted her inbox before. You write a story about old cemeteries or local hauntings and they find you. They always do. But none of them had delivered letters in the night. None of them had walked like shadows with eyes. The next morning, Lucy found herself walking a different route to work. She told herself it was for the scenery. The quarter was lovely in the morning light, quiet for once with shutters cracked and the smell of chicory coffee drifting from opened doors. The mist lifted slowly from the streets. Musicians dozed in doorways, instruments in their laps. She told herself it had nothing to do with the man, with Remsdorf. But at the corner of Royal and Ursuline's, she saw him again. Same coat, same hat, same terrible stillness. He stood behind the gate of an overgrown courtyard, face half hidden under the brim of his hat. But his eyes were on her. She could feel them. She walked past without turning her head. Her steps didn't quicken. 10 feet on, she glanced back. He was gone. She got nothing done that day. The jazz profile remained a half-formed paragraph on a flickering screen. Her editor left her 3 voicemails. She ignored them all. Instead, she searched. Remsdorf. The name returned almost nothing. Philanthropist and historian, the letter had stated, but evidence of such was lacking. She was about to give it up when she came across a name listed on a recent high-dollar real estate transfer, Remsdorf Properties, LLC, linked to the purchase of a historic home on the edge of the Garden District. "Who are you?" Lucy whispered. "And what do you want with me?" That night, as the quarter came back to life and the lights flickered across the rain-slick streets, Lucy Pelgrim found herself pacing the old stones again. She had questions, and for the first time in days, she wanted answers. She navigated the neighborhood like an automaton, her destination far off the beaten track. She passed under an iron archway marked with peeling paint, strolled by a dozen shuttered facades behind which muted voices cackled and croaked. At the heart of the maze, a tight alley curled into darkness, and there, at the far end, glowing faintly behind a curtain of thick beads and smoke-colored glass, was a wooden sign. Job Baptiste, spiritual consultant, tarot, candles, protection work, ancestral contact. Without hesitation, she opened the door. The bell above it clinked, like something ancient and rusted, and the sound died quickly, swallowed by the dense atmosphere inside. Lucy crossed the threshold and stepped into another world. The first thing she noticed was the smell, a heady, almost syrupy blend of sandalwood, dried river moss, and a hint of something vaguely coppery, like congealed blood. The air was warm and unmoving, thick as the inside of a lung. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, all bowed under the weight of cluttered jars, dusty skulls, bundles of herbs wrapped in twine, glass bottles filled with cloudy liquids, and candles, dozens of them, melting slowly into antique dishes and cracked saucers. She took a step forwards. The floor creaked. "Careful now," said a voice from the shadows. "The spirits in here don't like to be stepped on." Lucy turned sharply. A man emerged from behind a velvet curtain. He was tall and slender, with skin like polished bronze and eyes the color of black coffee, sharp and reflective. The suit he wore was old-fashioned but well-kept, a black linen jacket over a pale shirt with a narrow collar, and dark trousers. Around his neck hung a charm, a piece of bone carved into a spiral, dangling on a strip of red cord. "Job?" Lucy ventured. The man inclined his head slightly. "That's what the sign says. You the one the spirit's been buzzing about all week?" The young journalist blinked. "Excuse me?" Job smiled, a tight, crooked smile. "You brought a shadow in with you, Miss Pelgrim. Clung to your coat like a wet dog. Still dripping, too." Lucy frowned, unsettled. "How do you know my name?" "Didn't, until you opened your mouth. Now I know the rest." He moved around the counter, slow and certain. "You're Lucy Pelgrim, granddaughter of George and Linda. Daughter of the ones who never made it to Thanksgiving. Reporter, lives alone, spends too much time chasing stories that don't want to be found." "Have we met?" "Not in this life." He gestured to a stool, a mahogany thing buffed to within an inch of its life. "You want to sit down?" Lucy hesitated, then sat. Job leaned against the counter, one long finger tracing a half-circle through spilled ash. "I don't usually get visitors who come through that alley unless they're already halfway cursed. You, though, you got something following you. Something old." She was silent. Job continued, quieter now. "You've seen it. Tall man, big, pale. Doesn't blink. Damp even when the sun's high. Smells like wet stone and funeral flowers." Lucy nodded slowly. "He's watching me. Always standing just far enough away that I can't get a good look at him. But he knows where I am, knows my name." "And he left you a letter." It wasn't a question. Job knew. Lucy pulled it from her coat and unfolded it slowly. Job glanced over it with a small snort. "Remsdorf, damn. That name again." "You know it?" The man with the coffee-black eyes stepped back from the counter and yanked open a drawer. From it he withdrew a long, slim box bound in black cloth. With great care, he untied it and laid out what looked like a sheaf of brittle newsprint, clippings yellowed and foxed with age. He pointed to a headline, "Frozen Monster in Canadian Morgue," and another, "Weird Tale or Wartime Hoax." "This one's yours," he added, sliding a third across the counter. Lucy leaned in. It was a typewritten article with no byline, a familiar name in the first sentence, George Pelgrim. The man calling himself Remsdorf was not entirely human, though he passed as such in daylight. His obsessions were always twofold, survival and legacy. What he couldn't possess he sought to reproduce, through control, through blood. And Linda, my wife, was meant to bear his future. Lucy's hands clenched the paper without realizing it. "He was real. He's real." Job nodded slowly. "They thought they'd beaten him, but he kept coming back." Lucy shook her head. "No, this is insane." "Not insane." Job moved behind the counter again, hands brushing against small jars and bones. "Just old. Older than you think. Some things don't die. They wait. They soak up time like a sponge and squeeze back into the world when the lights go out." "You said my name means something." "It means you're the last thread in the cloth. George and Linda didn't just elude him. They defied him. Broke the chain. You're the next in line. And Remsdorf's the kind of man who doesn't like unfinished business." Lucy swallowed hard. "So what do I do?" "You learn." Job paused. "You fight." He reached under the counter and pulled out a small, sealed jar. Inside, Floating in dark brine was a sliver of pale, veined flesh. "What the hell is that?" Job's eyes didn't leave hers. "Piece of him. Came to me through a woman who bought a farmhouse upstate. Found it nailed inside a wall, wrapped in muslin. Still warm." Lucy stared. "He wants to become more than a man," Job said. "And to do that, he needs you. Bloodline. Willing or not." She stood, unsteady. "Then we stop him." Job's grin returned. "Now you're talking." 2. They sat on either side of the counter. Lucy upright, pale but still composed. Job cross-legged on a low stool, shuffling through brittle folders, his long fingers gentle with the paper, as though afraid it might whisper something to him if handled too roughly. "Your grandfather," he said, "was a better writer than the world ever gave him credit for." He passed her a sheet from one of the clippings, an unpublished column draft, likely intended for a Sunday edition that never ran. The type was warped, the margins uneven, and the ink had bled in places where moisture had got to it. But the voice was unmistakable, tight, methodical, laced with just enough dread to cut through the newsprint. The man calling himself Lothar Remsdorf Jr. was not a lunatic in the classical sense. He was something older, stranger. His madness had method. His method had history. The science that made him might once have had a name, but it has been lost now, to dust and dampen, the darkness that gathers behind the stars. Lucy exhaled slowly. "So he was created, not born." Job nodded. "There are stories, bits and pieces, scrawled notes from psych ward files, reports from doctors who were later institutionalized themselves. A scientist, Ramsdorf Sr., claimed to have discovered a process to modify human tissue, to untether the body from time, from entropy. He thought he was building a better man. What he got was, well, the thing you've seen." Lucy's voice dropped to a whisper. "But how did he survive? I mean, my grandparents, they beat him, right?" Job offered a grim smile. "Your grandfather wrote that he watched the creature melt into steam. Said there was nothing left but a rag and the stench of salt rot." He gestured vaguely to a nearby shelf. "But things like that don't vanish. Not completely." He stood and crossed to a bookcase, dragging a small step stool under him. He retrieved a faded volume and laid it on the table. Lucy watched as he opened it, the pages creaking like the floorboards. She saw the name on the flyleaf, Linda Pelgrim. A handwritten line below it read, "For George, in case he forgets." Inside were loose pages, journal entries, lists of names, scrolled floor plans, and a recurring symbol, a black circle with 7 short lines radiating outwards like sunbeams. "That's the mark," Job said. "They found it carved into a basement door, painted on a train car window, burned into the inside of a hotel mattress. Wherever he went, that symbol followed. My guess is it was his father's way of branding him. Or maybe it's something worse." Lucy touched the edge of the drawing. "I've seen this before," she whispered. "In a dream." "Not a dream," Job corrected. "A memory." She looked at him. "Blood holds strange things," he said. "Echoes. It carries not just traits, but impressions. Your grandmother carried those memories. So did your mother. And now you do." Lucy pulled the book closer and flipped to a page marked with a red ribbon. It was a letter never sent. "George, I saw him again last night. In the mirror, in the bath. He looked different, paler, more human, but I knew it was him. I'll always know. He called my name without moving his lips. I think he's in the water now. Not in it, of it. as if he dissolved himself and waited in the pipes. Lucy shivered. Job took the book from her gently. He doesn't age, doesn't forget. And if he's back now, if he's wearing a new name, he ain't here to haunt. He's here to finish what he started. Job hesitated, then reached under the counter and withdrew a single stiff letter. The paper was folded over at the corners, its type uneven, dull. "This is the last thing George wrote," he said. "I found it folded in the second volume of Linda's journal. Never published, never mailed." Lucy read it in silence. The tone was different. It was disjointed, like a confession. "He left something in me, a dampness under the skin. It's a part of me now." "He thought he was infected," she murmured. "Or changed," Job replied. "He believed the damp man wasn't just a person, but a process, a condition, something that could pass between people like decay in an old house." "What happened to him?" "He vanished," Job said. "Went north, said he'd found a trace, some obscure medical theory, a place that might help. That was before Linda even knew she was pregnant." Lucy stared at the paper. "My father never talked about him. He never knew him." "He might have thought he was protecting you." Lucy didn't reply, but the silence between them thickened, and in it the ghost of her grandfather lingered. The young journalist folded the letter. Her hands trembled. "Gunther," she breathed. Job stood and began to pace, hands clasped behind his back. "I know that name." He moved to a dusty filing cabinet and pulled out a single laminated piece of paper. On it was a grainy scan of a handwritten label. "This was found in an abandoned lab in upstate New York. Document tag, Gunther solution, LV07. A tissue sample, preserved in a vat of salt water and glucose. Went missing 20 years ago." "You think he used it to, what, regenerate?" "I think," Job said slowly. "He never really went away. And someone, maybe a fool, maybe a believer, provided him with the means to return." Lucy didn't speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was flat. "He knows who I am." "Yeah." "He's watching me." "Yeah." "And he wants to make me like him." Job gave a single, reluctant nod. That was always the plan. A silence stretched between them. Outside, rain tapped the window again. An irregular tapping, wet splashes like the sound of bare feet on stone. Lucy turned towards the window. A shape loomed there, just beyond the glass, huge shoulders and a pale face, dark and motionless. "Don't," Job said softly. "Open the curtain." "I wasn't going to." "He can't come in unless you let him. Not yet. But the longer you stay still, the more your scent he carries. That's how he works. He lingers." "What do we do?" Job took her by the shoulders. "We prepare." By morning, the figure outside Job's shop had vanished. Or perhaps it had simply dissolved, back into the mist, back into the gutters, back into whatever cracks in the world allowed for such a thing. Lucy hadn't slept a wink. She didn't think Job had either. He'd lent her a cot in the back room, behind a red curtain that didn't quite close, and beside a wall lined with empty bird cages and glass bottles. The air had grown heavier overnight, and everything, floorboards, fabrics, her very breath, smelled faintly of copper and damp wood. Now, as the quarter stirred to life under a pale sun, she sat at Job's cluttered counter, eyes glued to her laptop, fingers clicking softly. Her shoulders ached, but the trail had begun. Gunther Remsdorf. She typed the name again. She had done it 12 times already. Each time something different came up, and each time that something disappeared the moment the cursor threatened to touch it. A charitable trust based in Switzerland, gone. A corporate holding group with real estate investments across 4 states, gone. A private scientific foundation in Maryland with a redacted founding document, gone. The search results flickered, then blinked themselves out like lights on a faulty grid. It was more than coincidence. This was by design. "Someone's scrubbing his trail," she murmured. Job, across the shop, didn't look up from the mortar he was grinding. "Not someone," he said. "Him. You think he's doing it?" "No," Job shrugged. "But he has his helpers. Always has. There were men before. Stooges, lackeys, whatever you want to call them. Don't need much upstairs, just need to follow orders. And maybe forget how to blink." Lucy sat back, staring at her screen. Her cursor blinked against a blank page. "I need to know where he lives." Job set down his tools, wiped his hands, and walked over. He opened a ledger and flipped through pages filled with precise handwriting, newspaper clippings, and digital printouts. 2 weeks ago," he said, "a private firm out of Delaware purchased the old Tremaine estate near Audubon Park. No press release, no open house, no public listing. Closed-circuit cameras in every corner, wired into a separate grid." Lucy leaned forwards. "Remsdorf?" Job grinned whimsically. "What do you think?" "And you think he's inside?" "I know he is. He's always close to what he wants." Lucy said nothing for a moment. Then, "We should go." "No," Job said firmly. "We don't approach him. Not yet. You're not ready." "I'm not afraid." "That's not the point." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "This ain't about fear. It's about proximity. Every minute you're near him, he learns more. Your habits, your timing, your blind spots. He doesn't need to be fast. He just needs to wait for the moment you forget he's watching." Job looked past her, out of the window, to where a pale smudge of a man had once stood. That afternoon, Lucy left the quarter. Job insisted she take one of his wards with her, a coin-like disc carved from swamp bone, etched with a protective rune and dipped in salt and ash. She wore it under her shirt, on a chain around her neck. "It won't stop him," Job had said, "but it'll sting him, and sometimes that's enough." She took the streetcar uptown and wandered the perimeter of the Tremaine estate. It was larger than she'd expected. 3 stories of weather-worn stone and fluted columns, tucked behind a high wrought iron fence. Ivy grew along the walls like veins. The windows were dark and curtained. But someone was home. A pale shape moved behind the second-floor drapes. Just a shadow, but broad, still, watching. She turned away quickly, her heart stuttering, and walked the long way back. That night, her apartment building lost power for 32 minutes. Just her block, dead silent and lightless. The street lamps outside dimmed first, one by one, like eyes closing. Then the hallway lights buzzed out, followed almost instantly by the lights in her apartment. It was dreadfully eerie. The hum of pregnant silence and the distant creak of pipes adjusting to an unnatural stillness. Lucy lit a headlamp and sat in her living room with a baseball bat across her lap, her breath shallow. It wasn't long before she sensed it. Something beyond the thin drywall and window pane, just outside the hallway window. Frozen, she sat there, tense, tracking every creak. The headlamp's beam cut across the room, catching motes of dust that swirled and fell like ash. Then she stood slowly and crossed to the window, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. At first, She could see nothing but her own reflection. But soon enough her keen eyes caught the outline of what loitered beyond the glass, a tall, thin, motionless shape, crooked at the shoulders. It wasn't the damp man. Not even half the size of the bulk she'd seen under the street lamp. This figure was much leaner, less assured in its posture. Lucy pressed her hand to the glass. "Who is that?" she said aloud, with a good deal of nerve. The thing just twitched, the scrape of shoe rubber on concrete. She pressed her face to the glass. "What do you want?" The figure shifted, then moved away, stiff-legged, retreating down the passageway in slow, shuddering steps. She watched it vanish into the gloom. 10 minutes later, the lights came back on with a soft snap. Lucy gathered her coat, left the apartment, and returned to Job's shop. 3. The building wasn't on any map. It had been once, back in the 40s, when it was part of the state-funded Glenwood Sanitarium complex in upstate New York. But the sanitarium had closed in the 50s, quietly and without ceremony. The grounds had been sold to developers who never built. The land turned wild again. Trees swallowed the roads, vines cracked the windows. Roofs caved and records vanished. All but one structure remained, a low concrete annex half buried under a hill, a rusted door marked LV07, and a row of broken floodlights. Dr. Ethan Bruck had found it by accident. He'd been trawling through a digitized archive of early biomedical patents while perusing his own research into post-trauma cellular regeneration. Most of the material was quackery or badly disguised military proposals, but one document caught his attention, a scanned schematic of an independent extracellular modification tank, signed by one Lothar V. Remsdorf Sr. There were notes, heavily redacted, about liquid physiology, core serum structures, and something called the Gunther solution. Bruck followed the paper trail, connected the dots, and traced the last known shipping manifest for LV07. The documents were fragmented, damaged, scattered across 3 states, but they all pointed to the same forgotten corner of New York, and eventually to the tank. It was there still, sunk halfway into the ground like the fossil of some industrial monster, rimmed with moss and dead leaves. The concrete walls of the annex were cold to the touch, even in the late summer heat. The interior smelled of mildew, old wiring, and something else, a faintly sweet note, like overripe peaches left too long in the sun. Bruck wore gloves and a respirator the first time he entered. He catalogued the space with slow, reverent care. Stainless steel tables built into the walls, rows of specimen jars, some broken, some intact, steel file cabinets with warped drawers that shrieked when opened. And at the far end of the corridor, behind a reinforced glass door, was the chamber. It was cylindrical, 10 feet tall, 6 feet across, made of tempered glass cloudy with time. Inside was a liquid thick as syrup, translucent like the color of weak tea. Suspended in the fluid, curled like a child in utero, was a man. At least it appeared to be a man. His skin was deathly white. His body was hairless, long-limbed, bloated. The mouth was slightly open, revealing toothless gums. His fingers were webbed at the base. His chest didn't rise. His eyes were closed. A small, faded tag was bolted to the tank's base. Lothar V. Remsdorf Jr. Gunther Series Sample 07. Status: dormant. No direct electrical stimulation. Containment: 68 degrees Fahrenheit, saline serum. Do not thaw without core regulation protocol. Bruck stared at the tag for a long time. Day by day he returned, and by the end of the week, he'd abandoned his respirator. The plan was sensible at first. He'd make a full digital record. He'd extract a minor tissue sample, test the solution, and perhaps publish a paper. He never meant to revive the man, but he couldn't resist. Not after he placed his hand on the tank and felt, impossibly, heat, nor after the condensation on the glass began to throb, as though stirred by a low, rhythmic heartbeat. And what of the apparent twitching of the figure's fingers? Brack checked the logs, the gauges, the fluid levels. Everything had been static for 70 years. But something was changing. The liquid became less viscous. The temperature rose by 3 degrees, and inside the tank, the man's eyes opened. Brack dropped his clipboard at the sight of those black eyes. It struck the floor and echoed like a scream in the metal-walled chamber. The figure didn't move, but its eyes, those impossible eyes, remained open, watching. Brack activated the camera with a shaking hand, narrating each movement aloud, though his voice had begun to falter with the weight of disbelief. He drew samples from the tank's fluid, careful not to let the viscous substance touch his skin, and placed them under the microscope. Incredibly, the cells were alive. They were self-replicating, with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as though governed by something ancient and unhurried, something that understood time as a thing to be endured. Stunned, Brack ran the tank footage through filters, isolating the figure's facial structure frame by frame, comparing it to archived photographs. Remsdorf Sr. from old magazines, faded death certificates, military files, even a weathered family crest etched into a gravestone. The resemblance was unmistakable, though now swollen, distorted, and grotesquely preserved. Brack didn't sleep that night. He penned 13 pages of observations, scattered notes, half-drawn diagrams, and erratic theories about life suspended between states. The final line, written in an unsteady hand, read only, "The return of the damp man." It was on the 9th day that it happened. Brack was finishing his cataloguing of the last drawer of preserved slides, lost in the ritual of it, when a sound cracked through the stillness. He turned sharply, breath halting. The tank was no longer inert. Fine, hairline fractures radiated from the place where the figure's hand now rested flat against the interior, fingers spread unnaturally wide. The figure's eyes, those impossibly black eyes, were open again, focused. Brack froze, instinct driving his pulse into his throat. Then, slowly, with the helpless caution of a man waking from a bad dream inside another, he stepped backwards, his boots scraping faintly on the concrete floor. There came a soft pop, and then, with a groan from deep within the tank's metal frame, the entire structure began to split, as if following a hidden seam. The thick fluid inside surged outwards in a single syrupy wave, splashing down in slow sheets that darkened the floor with steaming residue. And with it, the body, still pale and cold, slumped wetly to the floor. The stench hit Brack like a blow to the chest. Salt and mildew, chemical tang, something sweet and rotten, as if decay had mixed with the fluid of life and curdled under the surface. The doctor gagged and turned, and then it moved. First one leg, then the other, long and slick, shifting with the sound of wet rope being dragged across tile. The back arched, vertebra popping like the ticking of a broken metronome. Thick fluid drained from its open mouth, and the head rolled, turned, then tilted upwards. The black eyes blinked, slow, calculating. Brack backed away, tripped on the edge of a table, and fell hard, landing in a muddled heap. The thing rose. It was tall, very tall. its limbs much too long for its torso, which was broad and heavy, like a man engorged with water. The skin was pale and glistening. Its hands hung low, the fingers fat and wide-tipped, like the pads of something evolved for water, not air. The chest was moving now, shallow, tentative, practicing the rhythm of breath after decades of silence. It turned its head again, saw the doctor lying face down on the floor, and smiled. What followed happened in a matter of seconds. One moment, Bruck was scrambling to his feet, hands slick and slipping against metal. The next, the figure was behind him. A hand, cold, wet, and inhumanly strong, closed around his throat and lifted him off the ground in a single, effortless motion. The doctor kicked. He clawed and gurgled. The creature drew close. It leaned in until Bruck could see the fine droplets of water clinging to its lips. And then it spoke, uttering its first words in over 70 years. "Where is she?" It's likely that the facility's cameras caught the whole thing, but when the footage was recovered, the audio had dissolved into static. The time codes were corrupted. The backups were gone. Bruck's body was never found. But a man, or something resembling one, was seen walking out of the annex barefoot, wearing a long, dark coat taken from a nearby locker. His skin, once gleaming, had already begun to dry and coarsen under the sun. He moved slowly, methodically, pausing only to drink from a rusted rain barrel until it stood empty before him. By nightfall, he was seated in a roadside motel outside Syracuse. He had 2 names now. One was his origin, the other his mask, and both would serve a single purpose: to finish what he started. 4. The invitation arrived in a black envelope, thick as skin and pressed with that same unusual sigil, the stylized R in a 7-pointed star. Miss Lucy Pelgrim, guest of honor, the Remsdorf Foundation, Evening Salon, Marche Gallery, Royal Street, 8 p.m. Lucy touched the wax with the tip of her finger. It was still soft. "He wants something," she said to Job, who'd taken it upon himself to walk her home. "He always does," the man with the coffee-black eyes answered. "Then I want to hear him ask for it." The gallery was an old colonial building with wrought iron balconies and chipped plaster walls the color of bone. It had once been a Masonic hall, and before that a sugar broker's office, and before that, according to Job, something far older, which the French hadn't bothered to translate. Lucy arrived alone, in a dark, low-key dress. Under the dress, on a chain around her neck, hung the ward Job had given her. She'd burned it over salt and recited the name he taught her 3 times, low and breathless, like a secret prayer. Inside, the lights were dim and indirect. Glass cases held sculptures of twisted human figures, their limbs overlong, torsos arched backwards in ecstasy or agony, or both. People drifted through the space like polite ghosts, wealthy, faceless, murmuring to themselves inaudibly. And there among them, in a far alcove under a canvas smeared with indistinct colors, stood Gunther Remsdorf. He was taller than she remembered, certainly broader. He wore a black 3-piece suit, perfectly cut, and a dark silk tie that gleamed like wet onyx. His eyes, when they found hers across the room, were empty of life. Not once did he blink. Lucy moved forwards, as if drawn to him by wires. "Miss Pelgrim," he said, his voice low and unsettlingly warm. "I hoped you'd come." "You invited me." "Yes," he said, "but I don't like to presume." "You've been following me." He tilted his head slightly, as if in contemplation. Not following, observing, protecting, in a sense. From what? His smile widened. From being forgotten. She was close now, and the air around him felt humid, though there was no source of moisture. He radiated it, a constant, low dampness, like a cellar that has never truly dried. She met his eyes. What do you want? You know what I want. You're not his descendant. No. He took a step closer. I am him. There it was, spoken plainly. Lucy's breath caught, and she hated herself for it. You died, she said. He nodded. More than once. You're insane. I'm patient. His gaze lingered on her mouth, her cheek, her collarbone. You are the completion of her, he said softly. You're what she could never give me. Time. A second chance. She stepped back. The air cleared slightly. You can't have me, she said. No. He turned his head towards the canvas behind him. Lucy followed his gaze. The painting was abstract, shades of blue and grey in thick, smeared ridges, and a figure in red, arms stretched upwards, surrounded by dark water. Her mouth went dry. The giant before her reached into his pocket and drew out a folded note, extending it without urgency. It was a page from her grandfather's manuscript. He moved in steam, in fog, in places no man should dwell, and when he returned, he wore a name not his own, but the hunger had not changed. How did you get this? She whispered. I was there when he wrote it, he said. Liar. I watched him. I watched all of them. And I watched you, Lucy, from the first moment you drew breath. He stepped closer again. Your blood sings to me. You are the last echo of what I began, and I am ready to begin again. Her hands were shaking. Job had told her not to touch him, not to engage with him for too long. So she turned her back and simply walked away. The damp man didn't stop her. The night was cool, damp with a mist that hadn't quite become rain, and the streets of the quarter glistened under the orange smear of street lamps. Lucy walked like someone who refused to be moved, her steps purposeful, her shoulders high despite the weight that had settled on them. She hadn't said where they were going, only that they were going. Job had simply nodded. They met on shut, under the leaning awning of a crumbling bookshop, and without a word, Lucy turned down the narrow path towards the speckled cat. It was a place battered by time, long and low, lost between taller buildings that had forgotten it was there. Inside, a trio played something slow and coaxing, bass, keys, and sax. The floor was dark wood, the air thick with citrus and shadow. Job followed Lucy to a corner booth. He removed his hat and folded it neatly beside him. She said nothing at first, and neither did he. The music was conversational in its own way, and neither wanted to interrupt. After a while, Lucy turned to him. My grandfather used to come here, she said. I found a matchbook in one of his old files. Thought I'd see if it still existed. Looks like it does, Job said. He used to sit near the back, making notes while the music played. You know, thoughts, feelings. I think he believed he was hearing something honest, something unfiltered. Job shifted in his seat, fingers gently tracing the edge of his glass. You think he saw him? Lucy went on. The damp man, before he vanished? I think old George got too close to something, Job said. She considered that in silence. You ever lose someone? She asked. He nodded slowly. A sister. Long time ago. She was sensitive, like you in some ways. Dreamer. Woke up crying at things no one else could see. One night she stopped talking altogether, just pointed at a mirror and said, "He's here." That was the last thing she ever said. Lucy drew a sharp breath, but didn't speak. My mother thought she'd gone mad, Job continued. My grandmother said it was a gift. Maybe it was both. And you've been doing this ever since? Not always this, he said. Sometimes I help people who've seen too much. Sometimes I just listen. But when something like this crawls out of the cracks, you don't get to ignore it. Not if you've seen what it leaves behind. Lucy turned her eyes back to the stage. The music had dropped to a whisper now, coaxing secrets from the piano. Job watched her for a moment before speaking again. He's getting closer. I know, she said. Job leaned forward slightly. He doesn't just follow. He learns. Every hour he ain't stopped, he sees more of you. Where you walk, how you breathe, what you fear. Lucy drained the rest of her drink. Then let's give him something new to see. Before long, they left the speckled cat. The mist had thickened into a low fog that clung to the lamplight and turned the air metallic. Their footsteps were the only sound on the slick pavement. Job glanced over his shoulder more than once. Lucy said nothing about it, but she noticed that his right hand remained in his coat pocket, curled around something she couldn't see. The alley ahead was darker than it should have been. The street lamps on either side blinked in slow, irregular rhythms. One by one they went out with the deliberate hush of something being smothered. Job stopped. Lucy slowed, tension crawling up her spine like cold water. Then she saw him. He stepped from the mist, out of the air itself, as if drawn from condensation. He was even taller now. His coat dripped steadily, though the rain had stopped, and his eyes shone black under a dying lamp. Run, Job said quietly. But Lucy didn't run. Remsdorf moved forward steadily, his gaze fixed on the young journalist. Job turned towards him and raised his hand, but before the charm could leave his pocket, the damp man struck. The blow landed like a hammer on stone. Job's body lifted off the pavement and struck the alley wall with a sickening, wet thud. He slid down, dazed, blood already pooling in his hair. Lucy screamed, but Remsdorf didn't look at her. He just waited. She fumbled at her waist, fingers closing around the small, rune-marked charm. It burned against her palm. She held it out, spoke the word, a sound that felt like glass cracking under water. Remsdorf shuddered, as though something inside him had recognized the word. The fog surged around him, and when it passed, he was gone. Lucy knelt beside Job. You still with me? He groaned. More or less. She helped him up, his arm thrown over her shoulder. We can't go back to the apartment, she said. No, he muttered. We need to get off the map. They limped back towards Lucy's apartment in quest of her silver sedan. The fog retreated like a curtain drawn by unseen hands. And in that silence, somewhere in the thick of night, something watched with the patience of water filling a crack in stone. 5. They left the city before the first trace of dawn could bruise the sky. Lucy drove without speaking, her eyes fixed on the road, but her mind somewhere else, in the alley, in the fog, held by those cold black eyes that never blinked. Job sat beside her, head tilted against the window, a dark bandage pressed low against his scalp. The bleeding had stopped, but the throb of pain still danced under his skin like something trying to get out. New Orleans faded behind them, neon giving way to gas stations, old bricks surrendering to pine. The signs grew farther apart, the trees closer together. They passed no other cars. The last turn was unmarked, just a dirt road choked with branches. At last, nestled in a pocket of cypress and ash, the cabin appeared, crooked and throttled by vines. It looked like it had grown out of the soil, its wood darkened with age, the roof sagging under the weight of moss and disuse. Lucy killed the engine and stepped out into the silence. The air smelled faintly of rust and rotting leaves. She helped Job to the porch, where the boards creaked like old bones, and opened the door with a heavy iron key. Inside, the air was cooler. The cabin smelled of cedar, with the faintest trace of sage. There was no electricity, only shelves stacked with tallow candles, bundles of herbs, and dusty old books. The hearth sat empty, the ashes inside undisturbed for weeks. A pair of wool blankets hung from nails beside the door, and 3 narrow windows stared blindly into the trees. Job lowered himself into a worn armchair with a grunt. "This place safe?" Lucy asked. "As safe as houses," he said, managing a smirk. "It's completely off the grid." She closed the door behind them and locked it. The bolt thudded into place. For a while, the young journalist dedicated herself to basic tasks, lighting candles, starting a small fire, boiling water for tea. Job watched her quietly, his face pale but focused, the bandage damp with sweat. When Lucy finally sat across from him, her tea too cold to drink, she said, "We need to stop him." The man with the coffee-black eyes nodded. "I don't want to run again," she went on. "You won't have to." Job leaned forwards and opened the satchel he'd brought from the city. From within, he withdrew a folded cloth, heavy and dark, and under it a small notebook. He set both on the table, then stood and walked to the far side of the room. With effort, he pulled aside a rug and opened a low trapdoor beneath. "Help me," he said. She joined him. Together, they lifted something heavy from the crawl space. A long wooden box, tapered, bound in iron straps, its surface etched with symbols. It was cold to the touch and heavier than its size suggested. They laid it carefully on the broad dining table and pulled back the cloth. The lid was mirrored, bordered in tarnished brass, dull but still faintly reflective. When Lucy looked into it, her eyes seemed strange to her, older, wiser, distorted by things she hadn't yet done. "What is it?" she asked. "A vessel," Job said, "for binding, for containing. It was built long ago, during a flood year. Used once in the Atchafalaya to trap something they couldn't kill. It held for a time." "Why mirrors?" "To confuse the occupant," he said. "Prevent it from settling. A creature like Ramsdorff, he's still tethered to form. Mirrors disrupt his hold on it." Lucy stared down at the box, then up at Job. "But it won't be enough." "No," he said. "Not alone." He opened the notebook. The pages were handwritten, their edges ragged, the ink faded to a reddish brown. He turned to a marked page and tapped a small rune drawn in looping lines. "We need more than mirrors and iron. We need an invitation, something he can't refuse." He looked at her. "You mean me?" "I mean your blood." She didn't flinch. "How much?" "Not much. A drop." She rolled up her sleeve. Job produced a small needle, heated it briefly in the fire, and pricked her fingertip with practiced care. The drop fell into the open box and struck the mirrored surface with a hiss, spreading in delicate tendrils. Job sprinkled salt around it and whispered something in a tongue Lucy didn't recognize, but instinctively feared. Then he closed the lid. The cabin grew darker, though the fire had not dimmed. Lucy exhaled. Her hand trembled slightly. "He'll feel it," Job said. Tonight, maybe sooner. He'll come looking, and the symbols on the frame will pull him the rest of the way, but only if we place it right." "You mean the swamp?" He nodded. "Bayou Sauvage. There's a place, quiet water, no dredging, no light. We'll take the casket by airboat and sink it deep once he's inside." Lucy looked out the window. The forest pressed close, a tangle of grey-green limbs and shuddering shadows. "And you're sure it'll hold?" "Sure as Kilimanjaro rises like Olympus above—" "Really?" Lucy interrupted, grinning like a Cheshire cat. "What?" Job returned, raising his hands in defense. Shaking her head, she turned back to the window. "And what if it doesn't?" "Then we make sure it's buried deep enough that it'll take him a century to crawl out." Later, as Lucy laid her head on the cot near the fire, she felt the weight of what they'd built between them, a shared refusal to surrender. Job remained awake by the hearth, watching the fire shift and spit in its stone cradle, the mirrored casket sitting like a patient predator between them. This man, this spiritual consultant, had dedicated himself to her cause. He was considerate, patient, and now that she thought about it, quite handsome. Was this just another day in the office for the man with the coffee-black eyes, or was he invested in more than just her situation? Fate, it seemed, had brought them together, a little bit of history repeating itself. With the grace of a wolf, she edged across the room and gazed into his eyes in search of the fire that lit hers. What followed was as wild as it was inevitable. 6. The airboat drifted slowly across the black water of Bayou Sauvage, its hull cutting a silent path through lilies and moon-glinted reeds. Lucy sat low, hood drawn, the ward around her neck cold against her chest. Job piloted the boat with one hand, the other resting lightly on a weather-worn satchel that clinked faintly every time it shifted. The swamp was alive, but quietly, watchfully. Somewhere an owl hooted. Farther off, frogs croaked at ragged intervals, as if trying to warn one another of something undesirable passing between them. It had taken days to prepare, days of research, of pacing the floor under the hanging masks and jars of Job's shop, of studying her grandfather's notes by candlelight, memorizing the rituals that had not been spoken aloud in over half a century. They wouldn't kill the damp man. They couldn't, but they could bind him. They could bury him. Presently, the trees began to crowd together, limbs low and heavy with moss. The air grew close. The moon disappeared behind a veil of dark, shifting cloud. "This is the place," Job said. Lucy stood slowly, every joint like glass under pressure. She moved to the bow. They didn't speak again until the casket was lowered. Job did it with ritual care. Lucy stood back, holding a lantern. Her shadow swayed across the water, wavering as if uncertain whether it belonged to her at all. They anchored the tank in the center of the clearing, just under a leaning tree whose bark was carved with dozens of old initials, some of them still bleeding sap. Job reached into the satchel and drew out a small object wrapped in red cloth. He handed it to Lucy. Inside was a dress, a red dress, silk, folded and unnaturally preserved. "Linda wore this," Job said, "the night she ran, the night he took her." Lucy gulped at the thing. Her stomach turned. "You want me to wear it?" "I want him to see it," Job said. "He remembers it. The memory will draw him in." On the shore, Lucy slipped into the dress. It was a perfect fit. Job drew a ring around her feet, chalk, brick dust, and water from 7 rivers. Lucy stood inside it, while he painted 2 lines of charcoal under her eyes and whispered a phrase in her ear that made her skin crawl. Taking a deep breath, she walked alone into the clearing. The airboat drifted back into the reeds, and Lucy waited, lantern in hand, red silk gleaming under the stars. He answered the summons at 3 a.m. From the water he came, like something pushing upwards from the bayou's heart, silent and immense. Gunther, or rather Lothar. His suit clung to him like wet tissue. His skin was pale and glistening. "Lucy," he said. She didn't move as he trudged into the clearing. "The red suits you," he murmured, "just as it did her. You are so much like her, but stronger, brighter. Your blood flows with purpose." The damp man neared her. The night air carried his scent. Lucy's breath caught. "It's time," he said, opening his arms. "No more waiting. You've always known this." She took a step backwards. The casket's lid opened silently behind her, triggered by a remote Job had buried in the mud. The damp man paused. His mocking smile vanished. "You think you can trick me?" he said, a voice hollow now. "It's not a trick," Lucy said. "It's a promise." From the trees came a flare. Job raising a bundle of burning herbs, the smoke thick and red. The symbols on the tank began to glow. Remsdorf screamed, and he lunged forwards. Effortlessly, Lucy stepped aside, and the open casket, like a hungry maw, swallowed the damp man in a blink. The lid fell shut as Job raced over to bolt the locks, and the symbols flared as an eerie silence washed over the bayou. 7. By means of pulley and cord, Lucy and Job dragged the tank into the deepest sinkhole they could find, and the swamp gobbled it greedily. They waited 10 minutes, just to be sure. No bubbles, no movement whatsoever beneath the surface. The casket had disappeared completely, leaving only a ring of ripples that faded fast. "It's done," Job said, exhaling slowly. "It's as close to buried as anything that refuses to die." Lucy remained silent. Then she knelt. She dipped her fingers into the water, just the tips, and traced a line across her own brow. A gesture she didn't recognize, but one her body knew. They rowed back in silence. The bayou closed behind them. The trees watched, tall and mute. The mist curled across the water like lace floating in a bowl. When they reached the launch point, Lucy stepped onto the moss-covered dock and stood there a moment, unmoving, as though listening for something under the soil. Job didn't disturb her. Eventually she said, "He's not gone." "No," Job admitted, "but he's not here." She looked at him. "You think that's enough?" "It'll have to be," he said, lighting a cigarette wearily. They went walking the next morning, a slow drift through the quarter. They watched a man feed pigeons, a woman sketch tourists without smiling, a boy play trombone with the kind of casual genius that makes your chest ache. They ended up at Jackson Square. The river was bright behind them, the wind high and filled with sweet rot and motorboats and old things surfacing in the sun. Lucy sat on a bench near the general. Job sat beside her, hands folded on his knees. After a long moment, she said, "He saw me before I saw myself." "He saw what he wanted." "Same thing, isn't it?" Job glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "Not if you fight it." She smiled wanly. "You still think he's down there?" Job tilted his head, listening to something only he could hear. "Maybe, maybe not. But wherever he is, he's still watching. Lucy looked towards the horizon, where the river ran fat and gold and endless. She had nothing else to say. That night, the dream returned, familiar and weightless, and when Lucy drifted beneath the surface of the water, she didn't flail or choke, nor did she fear. She simply existed, suspended in the deep, wrapped in stillness. Around her, the darkness moved with a slow intent, like breath returning to lungs that had forgotten the rhythm. And then he was there, the suggestion of a man taking shape from silt and memory, his skin blooming from the current like something grown rather than born.
"You buried me,"
he whispered, his voice muffled and thick, like it passed through miles of water.
"But you can't bury water."
She looked down at her hands. They were not hers. The fingers were longer now, joined by the faint shimmer of something soft and connective. Webbing. She woke just before dawn, lying in a room where the air clung to her skin, and the window panes sweated as if something had exhaled against them from the outside. Her wood, once rigid and sharp-smelling, had cracked, only slightly, a fissure like a hairline fracturing glass, but it was enough to chill her blood. She lay very still under the covers, listening to the world breathe around her, not quite able to tell where her breath ended and something else's began. Far from New Orleans, beyond the broken highways and the forgotten trailheads of the Atchafalaya, a hunter swore that just before the fog rolled in, he saw something rise from the water, a tall, soaking figure dressed in black, standing perfectly motionless at the edge of the sinkhole, as if sculpted from the mist itself. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Only a trail of wet footprints remained, slanting back into the reeds, and a single red ribbon tied with unnatural care to the low branch of a cypress tree, fluttering softly in a wind that seemed to carry neither scent nor sound nor direction. Lucy Pelgrim lives, and so does the man who waits, under the city, under the surface, and at the heart of every dream she dares to dream. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,